The fact is that we are trying to rally support for the peaceful transition of power from Maduro to Juan Guaido, whom we recognize as president. So I'd like to see as broad a coalition as we can put together to replace Maduro, to replace the whole corrupt regime. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, certainly Maduro is nobody that I would defend in any way. But,
well, that's good to hear.
But do you not see that the United States support for other brutal dictators around the world undermines the credibility of the argument you're making?
No, I don't think it does. I think it's separate. And I think, look, in this administration, we're not afraid to use the phrase Monroe Doctrine. This is a country in our hemisphere. It's been the objective of American presidents going back to Ronald Reagan to have a completely democratic hemisphere. I mentioned back at the end of last year that we're looking very much at the troika of tyranny, including Cuba and Nicaragua, as well as Maduro. Our objective is to have Juan Guaido become the interim president so we can get new presidential elections.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malekafzeli, and our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. In preparing for this episode, I found myself going down a rabbit hole about the cactus. Prickly pear cactus, indigenous to Mexico, is a desert plant that grows an acidic fruit. It also happens to host on it an insect, the cochineal, that is used to make red dye. Both the plant and the insect were harvested by the Aztecs before the arrival of European settlers, and persist through today as an important symbol of Mexican culture. The cactus even appears in the Mexican coat of arms and on its flag. But when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the first half of the 16th century, they were extremely interested in the insect and its application as a dye. In medieval Europe, they were obsessed with red, which was used to paint the blood of Christ. So they shipped a whole bunch of cacti back east. And it was so popular that cochineal became the most valuable agricultural export by weight in the world in the 19th century. The plant itself even made its way to historic Palestine, where it gained its Arabic name, sabr, meaning patience. They were initially used by Palestinians as boundary markers, but grew on to take a more symbolic meaning of rootedness to the land, and after the Nakba, steadfastness in the face of intergenerational dispossession. The cactus has appeared in Palestinian resistance art, showing up in PLO posters going back to the 1980s. And during the forced starvation of Gaza during the genocide, Palestinians in the north took to eating cactus, with one Palestinian farmer lamenting that they were forced to eat patience with its thorns. To me, what this history demonstrates is how colonialism can generate bonds of solidarity across wholly different geographies. That's how I understand the quote attributed to Kanafani about the Palestinian cause not being for Palestinians only, but for every revolutionary wherever they are. In fact, it's the very premise of third worldism, that anti-colonialism can be a unifying force through shared symbols and ideally shared struggle. I know that's a bit of a roundabout way to get to our topic for this episode, which is about how the war on drugs and the war on terror have collapsed into one another. But I have a feeling it's a theme that we'll be returning to.
The foreign policy of the Trump administration has been darting around a plethora of different arenas in which to imprint its fist, but no arena is perhaps more in the White House's crosshairs than Venezuela. Since the president was re-inaugurated, the U.S. military has broken precedent by striking what it deems, quote, drug boats, unquote, in the Caribbean, killing all those on board under the explanation that these alleged pushers of fentanyl and cocaine, people whose identities aren't even known to even be accused of before being executed, are not just selling drugs, but are narco-terrorists. As narco-terrorists, just like regular terrorists, they can be killed without notice, without trial, without charge, outside of any declaration of war, just as was done to Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and countless other nations. We are now officially in a, quote, non-international armed conflict, unquote, with drug cartels, according to the president. And Latin American drug cartels like Cartel de Sinaloa, MS-13, and Tren de Aragua have been officially designated as terrorist organizations in between designations of groups like Kata'ib Sayyid al-Shuhada in Iraq and Ansar Allah in Yemen. But the head honcho, the drug kingpin according to Trump, the Justice Department, and the now officially renamed Department of War, is apparently none other than President Nicolas Maduro.
Today, the Department of Justice and State Department are announcing a historic $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. Maduro uses foreign terrorist organizations like TDA, Sinaloa, and Cartel of the Suns to bring deadly drugs and violence into our country.
Those who remember the run-up to the war in Iraq will recall how long and drawn out the process of justifying that war to the public was. The fake whistleblowers, the graphics, the schematics, the speeches at the UN, the seemingly endless leaks to the press about nefarious dealings that Saddam Hussein was up to. Here, in the run-up to what may very well be an all-out war against Venezuela to overthrow Maduro, there is very little to an almost shocking degree being put up by the U.S. government to justify it. In remarkably lazy fashion, the Justice Department is accusing Maduro and Venezuelan officials of being not only Latin American leaders engaged in drug trafficking, but being a cartel in of themselves, the Cartel of the Sun, and that Maduro is a cartel leader with a bounty on his head of tens of millions of dollars. How absurd this is should be obvious on the face of it, but that has not stopped the government from going hog wild with the aura of this supposed threat, both abroad and at home.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, lawlessness abroad has been matched by lawlessness at home as well. We've seen an increase in border fascism, we've seen ICE raids in communities across the country, and we've seen the continued weaponization of immigration consequences against critics of Israel in the United States, as the administration threatens to target the quote-unquote enemy within. How should we make sense of the blending of these frontiers? Is this a case of the imperial boomerang coming home from the Middle East? Or are we seeing a continuation of longstanding U.S. imperialism in the Western Hemisphere?
What has really been surprising to me about the rhetoric under Trump 2 is how much it is indebted completely and entirely to the war on terror. I mean, before this, you would oftentimes find stories about how they were finding prayer rugs out on the border, that Muslim terrorists are going to be coming in through Tijuana. I mean, under Biden, there were accusations that there would be October 7th style attacks coming in through the Mexican border because of Biden's border policies. But here, so much of this is through the lens of terrorism, of narco-terrorism, but that Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic State, all of these things are the same cause, essentially. I mean, this is what Kristi Noem argued just a few days before this recording. The idea being that there can no longer be any sort of difference in rhetoric, really. It all has to be under some sort of uniform cause against terror in general. And that terror is anti-American, it's both Islamic and drug-fueled, it is without any sort of cause or justification or purpose, it is just terror against the West and what it stands for, whatever that means.
I think you're absolutely right. Basically, everything that we're seeing, all of the new statuses and labels that are being turned against the enemies, so-called enemies of the United States in our hemisphere, are echoing all of the groundwork that's been laid over the past several decades in the war on terror. The very concept of the terrorist, right, is a label that is supposed to invoke a set of actions, but ultimately in its practice invokes a type of person. A person becomes a terrorist because they are labeled as such. It becomes basically equivalent to an enemy of the United States through the very act of its labeling by, for example, the State Department. But I think ultimately, when we're thinking about whether this is, the boomerang coming home or a continuation of longstanding policy, it's important to recognize that it's probably both, right? I mean, if you think about a boomerang, you have to throw it in the first place for it to come back. And when we think about the history of the United States, imperialism really started first at home. Our first expansion, our first imperialist expansion, was the expansion west in the fighting of the Indian Wars on our initial frontier. Our incursion into Mexico in the Mexican-American War pioneered a lot of the forces of imperialism, the racial conceptions that would continue to dominate our foreign policy, that would go truly global in the 20th century.
Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by someone who can speak a lot about this, Alexander Aviña. He is an associate professor of Latin American history at the Arizona State University School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. But before we turn to that conversation, a reminder. This is a free episode, but we are a wholly listener-funded program. That means no ads, no sponsors. We're dependent on listeners like yourself to keep the show going. If you're able, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to support our work at turbulencepod.substack.com. If you donate $5 a month, you will get access to news roundup episodes where we will give our more candid takes on the week's headlines. You will also have access to monthly live streams and be automatically entered into our book giveaways. We hope you'll join us.
Alex, welcome to Turbulence.
Hey guys, thank you for having me.
Before we get into contemporary matters of substance, we'd love to hear a bit from you about your personal trajectory. So if you could tell us a bit about your scholarship and perhaps what overarching questions animate your work.
Oh, so this is going to be the most boring part of the conversation, but all right, we got to get it out of the way. My trajectory, I'm a historian of Mexico and Latin America. If we go way back, I never intended to be a historian, but I was always surrounded by really interesting, cool oral histories from, especially like my grandparents, one grandfather in particular who died illiterate. He was a sharecropper in Mexico, but he was a great storyteller. And I think by the time I got to college, a lot of things came together in terms of like familial background and then being inspired by a really amazing professor at St. Mary's College of California, a professor by the name of Mirna Santiago, who really kind of helped me connect the dots into why I'd be interested in history as a discipline and why I thought back then, and I still continue to think now, that it's one of these disciplines that allows us to understand our current time of monsters. And it makes me, in a way, I'm like kind of like an arrogant historian, at least the way I act online, at least when I talk shit to people. But it's really like a disciplinary thing. Like I think history is an interdisciplinary discipline inherently. And I think it offers us a way to understand not only what's going on today, but also think about how to get out of this shit. So I became a historian of Mexico and Latin America primarily because of my familial background. My parents were undocumented migrants from the Mexican state of Michoacan. And I had this, coming to full circle by the time I got to graduate school that I was going to specialize in the area of history that was deeply and intimately connected to my family's own history. And I ended up writing a dissertation and later a book on the history of these peasant guerrilla movements in southern Mexico during the 1960s and 70s that were led by communist school teachers. So that the pedagogical aspect is something that also was really interesting to me in terms of becoming a historian. Like I wanted to teach history as well, not just research it, but to teach it in a way that I was inspired as a student, and hopefully I could provoke the same type of critical thinking and analysis that excellent professors and teachers had done in my situation. And now I'm currently working on another book on recent Mexican history, but this time trying to connect themes of state terrorism, political movements, and the origins of the narcotics industry in Mexico during the 1960s and 70s around this broad idea that drug wars are in actuality wars against poor people, and that in the Mexican case, the modern drug war began as a war against social movements, leftist movements, revolutionary movements led by the Mexican state. And that's its foundational base, and we need to understand that base in order to understand what's been going on in Mexico since 2006 during its latest iteration of a drug war that's claimed 500,000 lives. We have evidence of 120,000 people who were disappeared as part of this conflict. So it's the casualty rate and the level of violence is something that I think has been woefully undercovered in US media, even though it's like, right, I'm in Arizona, right? So it's actually pretty close to where I'm at. But, these are casualty numbers that we would see typically in a civil war or foreign intervention and foreign invasion that we've seen in other theaters, other parts of the world. So right now, my academic work has really been oriented toward understanding the origins of this horrific industrial sized scale of killing that has occurred in Mexico since 2006.
I'm curious, when you talk about Mexican left-wing movements, either in the present or in the past, did they connect America's treatment of the country and the current conflict with other conflicts that were happening in the Middle East, or America's treatment of other countries abroad? Was this a topic of discussion?
In the 60s and 70s, no, not amongst the armed guerrilla groups that I was looking at. The groups that I researched, they were more or less wiped out militarily by the mid-1970s. Around the same time that the Mexican left, more let's say communist parliamentary-oriented left, started to become legalized again and operate out in the open. And they actually did play a really interesting, important role in publicizing the issue of Palestine. Right. And you had a lot of the PLO set up an office in Mexico City in the mid to late 1970s, and they worked closely with some of these leftist communist groups in Mexico. But the underground armed groups that I looked at, for a variety of reasons, these armed guerrilla groups in Mexico were the most isolated in the Americas, right? Primarily because the Mexican government posited itself as a revolutionary government and therefore had really close links with like Cuba, right? So like you had this instance where Fidel Castro was really close to the head of Mexico's secret police. He was close to Mexico's PRI political leadership, even as that political police chief was wiping out the armed left in Mexico. So Mexico's movements received very little support, if any, and were amongst the most isolated of the armed left groups in Latin America. North Korea did train about 50 to 100 of them that belonged to a different group that I don't research, but they pop up in my book a little bit because they do interface with the groups that I research. So North Korea did train cadres that had been at the Patrice Lumumba Friendship University, and they go back to Mexico intent on waging revolution. I interviewed one of the guys who was involved in this, and he said that they went to all the different embassies in Moscow asking for help, and they all got rejected, except for the North Koreans. North Koreans like, yeah, send us some people and we'll train you guys. And they did. They trained between 50 to 100 well-trained cadres and everything from like martial art, like individual like martial arts to like ambush techniques, guerrilla warfare stuff. As soon as this group tried to start operating in Mexico, they were pretty much, infiltrated, arrested. But some of the cadres that escaped did go with other groups, including the ones that I researched in the southern state of Guerrero. And they did prove politically and militarily pretty instrumental in helping these peasant guerrilla movements do things like ambush the Mexican military. But by and large, these were really isolated. Even Mexico had, I think, like 40 armed revolutionary groups in the 60s and 70s. So they had a pretty large number, but they were really isolated internationally, primarily because they could not count on even like diplomatic or rhetorical support from revolutionary Cuba.
That's fascinating. I'm very interested in how leftist movements confront a state that has a legacy of national liberation, and particularly anti-colonial national liberation. We think about that in the United States, where the American Revolution is painted in a way as an anti-colonial national liberation movement. I think that's a lot easier to challenge that narrative than some of the states in Latin America, but they still pose very kind of difficult conjunctural issues for the movements for class or indigenous-based resistance that persist. I want to bring us to the question of the Palestine-Mexico border, which is a concept that you've written about. I believe it has like a longer lineage. I first came across it several years ago and kind of traced it back to an article written in 2010. Can you explain what this concept is? What is the Palestine-Mexico border? And maybe trace some of its evolution over the past 15 years or so.
Yeah, I'm very clear in my writings that I didn't coin the term. I think the earliest I found it was Jimmy Johnson was writing about it, maybe for NACLA. Maybe it's the same 2010 or 2012 article. I can't remember. And for me, I try to expand the idea of the Palestine-Mexico border beyond just like the physical, material, military infrastructure that currently exists on the U.S.-Mexico border, which is kind of the way that people like journalist Jimmy Johnson and another excellent journalist here in Tucson, Arizona, Todd Miller, have talked about it, right? For instance, Arizona-Mexico border, we have something like 50 to 60 fixed surveillance towers, and they're all Elbit built. So there's a long military-industrial university surveillance complex that has been created in southern Arizona since the early to mid 2000s that has helped create this broader border infrastructure that draws heavily on Israeli technology and logics. And so that's like the material idea or concept of a Palestine-Mexico border. And others, other scholars like my comrade geographer Taylor Miller has really done excellent work on in a bunch of different articles. But I also started to think about expanding the notion of the Palestine-Mexico border to think about what explains and what connects these like necropolitics of disposability that we see applied in genocidal fashion against Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in the West Bank, to African migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, to the more than, between, let's say, 25 to 75,000 migrants that have died trying to cross the US-Mexico border since the early 1990s. Like, what connects it? And, Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, gave this speech at COP28 toward the end of 2023 when he made that explicit connection, right? He made the explicit connection between the genocide in Palestine to European genocidal logics being applied to migrants, to the US, to the gringos applying the same genocidal logics to migrants and asylum seekers who are coming to the US. So for me, that Palestine-Mexico border is kind of the convergence points of where we can kind of understand where our ruling classes globally meet, both their thinking and their actions, and where they want to take us in the future. I would highly suggest, I think I posted like once a month, like clips from Petro's speech, but such a powerful speech where he's able to connect these dots in a really powerful, compelling way. Because that is like our future if we don't change course. Our future is the genocidal disposal of entire populations that are deemed surplus to our current political and economic and geopolitical arrangement. We're going to have entire groups of people and communities and nationalities erased and genocided because they don't fit the plans and the ideals of our global ruling classes, whether it's Palestinians in Gaza or whether it's Venezuelan fishermen getting blown out of the waters on the simple baseless allegation that they are somehow moving cocaine. So for me, I'm still thinking this through, right? Like I'm working on something right now that's trying to think about this concept and thinking about Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men movie. It's just a very nerdy academic piece that's going to come out in an edited volume that very few people are going to read, but it gives me the chance to think about that movie in particular as being kind of like a forerunner to this idea of a Palestine-Mexico border, because in that movie, there is a really interesting scene in a refugee camp where you have a very visibly identifiable West Asian, let's say, armed group of asylum seekers using green headbands who lead the rebellion inside the refugee camp, right? So, and this movie came out in 2006. So there's already like some hinting, right, that ideas and actions and movements that are going on in Palestine and West Asia are impacting the imaginary of a Mexican director like Alfonso Cuarón.
I think you've touched on something really interesting with the kind of broad meaning of the Palestine-Mexico border. One thing that is striking from my perspective is the potential trans-historical value of this concept, because we're talking about plans of the ruling class in a forward-looking capacity, but we're also talking about backward-looking lineages of colonial violence. And there's different moments throughout history where we can point to and draw those connections. We can look at what Israel is doing to the Palestinians and draw connections all the way back to the beginning of European colonialism in the Americas. We can point to the moment of the Mexican-American War, like the 1848 moment of territorial expansion. And we can look to the future and we can think about the disposability of peoples, not quite in the same way as earlier colonial moments, but thinking about the climate as the future conditions of disposability and thinking about the color line along that broader trajectory. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, I think, so reading the work of people like Linda Quickwivix or Adnan Hussein has allowed me to place, Balfour 1917 or even 1948 within this longer historical trajectory, just in the way that you describe it, Dylan, right? These trans-historical continuities and lineages that really point to a continuous shared logic of genocidal settler colonialism. I mean, that's what it is, right? Every context matters, region matters, there's going to be cultural valences, et cetera. But the continuous thread is a particular form of genocidal settler colonialism that's going to manifest itself in different places in different ways. But that's kind of like the theme that allows us to think about what links like the Crusades to 1492 to 1982, right? Like there's still like some really interesting, especially the people who are involved in it, the way they talk about these things, they're making these connections as well. The way that I came about thinking about Palestine in the context of my own research in like Cold War Mexico and Cold War Latin America is that when I was writing my first book, I have a chapter on the type of horrific counterinsurgent state terror that the Mexican state waged against the communal basis of support for these guerrillas. And one of the practices that they used was a practice of enforced disappearances, but in a very particular way. They would capture people, take them to an Air Force base on the outskirts of Acapulco, place them on airplanes, and they would fly over the Pacific Ocean and dump these people into the ocean. And when I was doing research on this, I found out that those airplanes were Israeli-made Arava airplanes, right? These short takeoff and landing planes that were explicitly built and marketed for counterinsurgency operations that actually were pretty terrible planes when the Israelis tried to use them themselves in the late 60s and early 70s. But they're like, well, they suck, but why don't we try to sell them to Latin America? And they did. All these like genocide, we can talk about this too, but all these genocidal death squad military regimes did prove to be really good customers for Israeli arms. And they loved this plane. I mean, it's a rugged, sturdy plane, short takeoff and landing. It can land anywhere. It can take off from anywhere. Anyway, the Mexican military was using this plane to dump people, probably at least 200 that we know of, into the Pacific Ocean. And this is when I started to think about, what's Israel doing here in southern Mexico in the early to mid 1970s, being used to dispose of people who were alleged to have been guerrilla fighters or supporters of guerrillas. And that allowed me to just this broader research and thinking on the role of not just Israeli arms and weapons in Latin America, Cold War Latin America, but also more importantly, I think these logics of counterinsurgency and settler colonialism that they commodify and export to places like Guatemala, El Salvador, where these military dictatorships prove very enthusiastic buyers and also practitioners of some of the methodologies that Israel had developed and was continuing to use against Palestinian populations in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip.
I think this is a good segue to talk more about the Israeli support for these right-wing regimes in Latin America during the Cold War. I mean, I think listeners are probably very familiar with how Reagan and other presidents were the guarantors of these regimes. I mean, was Israel like a critical support beam to these countries outside of simply sending them these arms and these vehicles through which they could continue to oppress people, to execute people?
Yeah, they were. I mean, it depends on the country we're talking about, but the ones in which Israel was most heavily involved and invested with, Israel was a critical beam of support for these countries. And yeah, you're right, Seamus, not just for the provisioning of military arms and counterinsurgency expertise in the form of military advisors, but these military dictatorships in places like El Salvador and Guatemala, they also knew about Israel's close relationship to the United States. So they figured, listen, if we're considered to be pariah nations within Latin America, maybe Israel, this other pariah nation, could give us voice or connections to different American presidential administrations. So they viewed Israel like a diplomatic gateway drug, I guess, to the United States. That was one way. But even just focusing on like military weaponry and munitions during the Carter administration, where human rights allegedly was shaping and motivating for U.S. foreign policy, which was bullshit, obviously, but it did have some real material ramifications for certain military dictatorship regimes in Central America, especially, where they stopped getting U.S. economic credit and access to U.S. weaponry and arms. And this is where Israel does step in, and they step in with kind of like a wink, wink from the United States. And this is also something that Israel was able to do throughout the Cold War in places like Africa and in Latin America, where they would go into countries where the U.S. could not for a variety of different reasons, including because U.S. Congress had forbade the U.S. president from getting involved in these conflicts. So in a country like El Salvador, by the late 70s, a vast majority of their arms came from Israel, something like 70 to 85%. Guatemala was something similar. And by the time we get to the 80s to today, Colombia's military and police are almost exclusively outfitted with Israeli weapons. All their different police corporations and their different arms branches of the military are almost exclusively reliant on Israeli weaponry, which is why Hugo Chavez, when he was alive, referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America. So just on arms alone, it was a critical beam. But these countries also saw Israel as a diplomatic ally that could help them get entrance to the United States political scene and to maybe convince the United States, with Israeli help, to stop cutting off aid to some of these governments because of human rights considerations.
Does Christian Zionism have any influence on the modern decision-making of these countries? I mean, in the United States, when the embassy was moved to Jerusalem, I remember a lot of people justifying that through explicitly Christian terms. And now Honduras, Guatemala, Paraguay, they've all moved their embassy to Jerusalem. Bukele, the current president of El Salvador, is himself Palestinian, yet he's still ingratiating himself further with Netanyahu. Is that a factor at all, or is this purely about wanting, as you say, to take advantage of this gateway drug to the United States?
I think it definitely plays a role. I mean, it's in Central America. I mean, there was also a big, there's been subsequent big waves since the late 19th century of West Asian migration into Latin America. So that's why in a place like El Salvador, we've had, I think, 3 Salvadorian presidents of Palestinian descent since like the year 2000. Honduras has had 2, I think 2 or 3 as well. And they span the political spectrum, right? So obviously Bukele, even though he began within the leftist FMLN party, like obviously he's to the right now. But Shafiq Kandal, who was the Secretary General of the Salvadoran Communist Party and a guerrilla leader during the 70s and 80s, he was also Palestinian, obviously on the left. So I think there is Christian Zionism in Central America plays a certain role. I think for me, the craziest thing is to see someone like Bukele, again, of Palestinian descent, engaging in that type of Christian Zionism to ingratiate themselves with Netanyahu in the United States. But I think, again, it's because they want Israel for a variety of reasons. They want Israeli support, but it also helps them get access to the United States. I think that's still a constant. In other countries in Latin America, Christian Zionism and Israel have become kind of like the trademarks of the Latin American right. So if you see an Bolsonaro anti-Lula protests in Brazil, the Israeli flags are ubiquitous in those protests, right? And it's because Brazil has gone through a rapid demographic change when it comes to religious affiliation. A once heavily Catholic country has become much more, 50-50 or 60-40 in terms of evangelical Christianity. Those branches of evangelical Christianity are thoroughly Christian Zionist. And those are also the supporters of Bolsonaro and the right wing. So in a place like Brazil, you have a very direct connection between Christian Zionism, the right, a revanchist right, I would say, and Israel and what Israel's doing currently to Palestinians. I think we probably see something similar in a place like Argentina with their interesting current president who embodies this connection, right? He famously converted to Judaism. So, and I'm talking about Javier Milei. So it's really, and the members of the Venezuelan opposition as well have looked toward Israel as a base of support against the administration of President Nicolás Maduro. So that, and Christian Zionism, I think, does play a critical role. I think it's both. I think it's the diplomatic support of Israel that then gives them access to the United States, but it's also a Christian Zionist connection. And it's weird now to see, I would say, a resurgent revanchist Latin American right using the Israeli flag as one of their symbols.
If we're talking about Venezuela, I do want to ask just maybe a big question here. Do you think right now that the U.S. will actually try to enact regime change against Maduro? And by regime change, I mean, like has been reported in Axios, try to assassinate him, like Israel tried to assassinate Khamenei in the war against Iran, threatened to, I should say.
I would say the U.S. has tried to initiate regime change in Venezuela since the early 2000s, and that's been the constant operation or thread. I think the way of achieving that has changed according to presidential administration within the U.S. I think in this latest iteration, it's hard for me to fathom any sort of Panama-style invasion where the U.S. goes in, even though that's that punitive expeditionary force that is currently stationed off the coast of Venezuela. It's a pretty powerful force, but it's not the type of force that you would need to get boots on the ground and to overthrow Maduro through some sort of overt military invasion of the country, which honestly, Venezuela is a huge country. It would cause a lot of problems for the U.S. So this is why I think they're trying to do a couple of things. One, they're trying to bait Venezuela into a type of response to what is now 3 U.S. attacks and obliterations of Venezuelan boats. And there was a 4th attack on a boat where they didn't blow it out of the waters, but they did harass and detain Venezuelan tuna fishermen for a few hours. I think this kind of operation is designed to elicit some sort of reaction from the Maduro administration that would then give a pretext for the U.S. to become more militarily involved. But even at that point, I think it would be in the form of like what Israel's doing to Palestine, overwhelming air power, combined with some sort of assassination attempts, right? Going after, and what they've done to Yemen, right? Like go after media workers in Venezuela and go after civilian ministers and members of government. And I think that the big target would obviously be Maduro. And this is one of the reasons why they charge him as being the head of a mythical cartel de los soles. And there's a $50 million bounty on his head.
Oh, is it 50 million now? I thought it was 20 million.
They doubled it. It was 25 and they increased it to 50.
Powerball's going up.
It's inflation. It's really weird. Like right before I logged on, I saw that the Al-Qaeda so-called president of Syria is coming to New York, and who once had a bounty on his head, but now he's welcomed, right? But Maduro is...
He's at a conference with Elmo. Like, he's fully integration. I don't know. I'm still shocked by it.
Yeah, I can't. The fact that happened like a space of a week, like what, last year, it's just, I can't get over it. But what makes it worse from as a Latin American was now to see that those bounties being placed on a president like Nicolas Maduro gets doubled to 50 million. And that becomes a pretext for some sort of targeted assassination. I think that's one clear possibility. I think the other clear possibility, and this is part of that longer U.S. effort to destabilize Venezuela since the 2002 coup attempt since Hugo Chavez, is to create the conditions to force regime change from within. And this has been like kind of U.S. MO toward Latin America, particularly since the Cold War. There's a declassified CIA document from the late 60s where the CIA analyst talks about how we can't go in, invade, and overthrow regimes we don't like. But what we can do is create the conditions for civil war. And then we just pour gasoline on those conditions. Create a fire and then like throw gasoline onto it. So they've been trying to do that to Venezuela since 2002. They finally gave up on Juan Guaido, who was recently spotted at the U.S. Open. So hopefully he like fucked off. But there's a Venezuelan opposition within the country that is still there, like trying to do some certain work. But again, the weird thing is if the U.S. does attack Venezuela in whatever way, and even not attacking, like what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is Venezuelan society closing ranks around a president who, depending on which poll you're reading, was pretty unpopular since the last electoral round. But now because of U.S. saber rattling and like extrajudiciously executing Venezuelan fishermen and maybe low-level narco traffickers, which to me is still, they've offered no evidence. They're producing the opposite effect of that strategy of creating the internal conditions for a civil war, creating a fire, and then pouring gasoline on it. So maybe targeted assassination might be the way to go, and the use of air power with surgical strikes.
I want to put a finer point on this because you've talked about longstanding U.S. strategy with respect to Venezuela. You talked about the effort to bolster Juan Guaido. And it seems like there's a real marked difference from the Trump 1 strategy and what we're seeing now. And I'm wondering if you think that Israel's genocide in Gaza opened up certain avenues, certain policy avenues, or changed certain strategic calculations. Because it is striking to me that in the first Trump administration, you had John Bolton going on television and talking about how, we're not scared to say the phrase the Monroe Doctrine in this administration. And getting behind Guaido, and the tone is a little different now, right? Now it feels much more like gunboat diplomacy, much more like you're saying, threatening massive destabilizing action with no real plan for what happens next. And I can't help but see echoes of the Israeli strategy in that. Israel's strategy in Gaza, Israel's strategy with respect to Syria, and also with respect to Iran. This notion that for enemy states, you don't need to take the perhaps like neoconservative approach of nation building and really emphasize nation destruction. And so we may not even be in a realm of regime change anymore if, what these states really view as their objective is, as you're saying, just cause a huge fire and then throw gasoline on it. So I'm curious how you connect what we're seeing in Gaza now or in the Middle East more broadly with the kind of shift in the Trump strategy between different administrations.
Yeah, without doing the typical historian thing of going back like 150 years, yes, I would say I do see a connection, right? I think we're in an entirely new moment where the so-called liberal international order, which was always kind of bullshit to begin with, we all know this, right? It was weighted, it was not fair, et cetera, et cetera. But the pretense of that is gone, right? And it's gone because of Israel's genocide in Gaza, I think. It even took Israel, like if we think back to the 700 plus days, like Israel didn't do it right away, right? Like we've seen like a gradual probing and testing of what they can get away with, right? Like, so thinking about like the justifications that they would use or offer to international audiences as to why they were bombing Al-Shifa hospital the very first time relative to what's going on today. I think that one example gives us an idea of that they've learned that that they don't have to care about this kind of stuff anymore, or the elaborate performance they did to prove that UNRWA was somehow connected to Al-Qassam. Like, they don't do that shit anymore, right? They don't have to. They've killed it. And I think that is directly connected to what Trump is doing today in Venezuela. I mean, it's also connected to, in a more immediate context, to what the U.S. did under Obama with expanding the drone program, right? Like, that was a similar thing, a different rhetorical style. There's a whole pretense of like national, international law somehow being on the side of the U.S. that justified, I don't know how many people, I mean, like 5,000 people ended up being killed in that we know of, in that expanded drone program that Obama began as soon as he took office in 2009. So that's, I think, an immediate predecessor context when we think about the targeted assassination of individuals, and when we think about those Venezuelan boats, those 3 boats that were just obliterated. But I think you're right, Dylan. The biggest event or process that has unleashed this previously existing form of gunboat diplomacy is everything that Israel has done to Palestinians in Gaza and everything that they've gotten away with. So we're now in a situation where none of this shit matters, right? Like, liberal international order doesn't matter. All these things that took more than a century to build up, again, imperfect, kind of BS, weighted, unfair. Trump's not even doing the Colin Powell thing of going to the UN and holding up like a fake thing of like fentanyl or cocaine and being like, hey, this is from Venezuela. This is from Nicolás Maduro. He personally sent it to me. That kind of shit. Like, they're not even doing that. And I think that's directly related to what Israel has gotten away with in Palestine, and the idea that there's nothing holding them back and there's no counterweight. They're just going to do what they're going to do. I think one big difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is they came in much more organized, with a clear and more coherent ideological agenda as it pertains to Latin America. Like, they came in with the idea that they are going to create a remuscular Monroe Doctrine. And a lot of this has to do because Marco Rubio is their point person on Latin America. He's a product of a particular unique, revanchist, anti-communist South Florida political milieu. Marco Rubio, who has made his career by pretending to be a member of the Cuban exile community that fled the excesses of Castro when he didn't. That's not true, right? His family came in 1956. If anything, they fled the dictator that Fidel Castro and the M26 movement was fighting against. But he reinvented his story to fit part of this Cuban exile story. And South Florida has been continuously nourished by a different wave of Latin American loser community. And I'm talking about loser, like not in like pejorative, but like they lost a certain political revolutionary process and they arrive in South Florida, revanchist as hell, like angry. So you have the Cubans, you have the Nicaraguans, you have someone like that CNN talking head, Anna, what is her name? Like, her dad was a Contra, and she's like very proud of like talking about how her daddy was a Contra and that she helped raise funds for the Contras in the 80s when she was a university student. And then you get the Venezuelans who came in the early 2000s. Yeah, Ana Navarro. Yeah, she's now she's a never Trumper, so she's a good person, I guess, in the eyes of the liberal media. But so that South Florida political culture is. My first teaching position was at Florida State University. I went directly from Los Angeles to Tallahassee, Florida, which was a cultural shock. Most of my students, particularly I taught Mexican history and Latin American history. Most of my students were from South Florida, and many of them were like products of this South Florida political culture. So when they took like my Latin American Revolutions class, the first time I taught that class was so rough. Man, I like learned a lot, like how to teach, because I had Cuban American students telling me, what you're teaching us is wrong. My dad said this. My mom said that. Fidel came and stole our apartment. I'm just like, and I was very combative. Like, I basically would say, like, you guys don't know shit. Like, listen to me. Like, I know what I'm talking about. But then I learned that, like, actually those narratives matter. They're actually very politically consequential. And they've produced somebody like Marco Rubio, who now is the lead person on Trump's Latin America policy. And it's a very, like, hardline, right-wing, anti-communist, death squad adjacent way of seeing Latin America. And it's also, again, based on this idea that the Monroe Doctrine has to be reapplied. It's never gone away. The Democrats are just as adherent to the Monroe Doctrine as Trump. They just have a different rhetorical style. They apply it in a different way. What's different with Trump, too, is that their bellicosity, their public bellicosity, both now materially, but also rhetorically. Because remember, when he came in to office, they were talking about taking back the Panama Canal. They came in and they renamed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, which is, I think only Google has followed him up on that. No one else is really saying Gulf of America. And now with the Venezuela expedition, now we see an actual material application of this idea that involves making the Caribbean once again into quote unquote the American lake, which goes back to like the days of Teddy Roosevelt, and to exercise and project imperial power over a government that they deem to be an enemy of U.S. imperial geopolitical designs. But part of this is so incoherent because everything they're doing to Venezuela is going to generate the conditions and the processes that they say they are fighting at home. The more you attack Venezuela, the more destabilized that country is going to become, the more Venezuelan refugees and asylum seekers are going to come to the United States. And this is another way to think about that Palestine-Mexico border, is to think about U.S. empire without any sort of actual physical political borders, that there is no border anymore between U.S. domestic policy and U.S. foreign policy in the Americas. It's the same thing. They're attacking and killing, right? ICE has killed 18 to 19 people. They're attacking and killing brown people and Latin American peoples in the United States, and they're doing it abroad in the Caribbean with these Venezuelan fishermen. There's no longer any sort of distance in my mind, like political distance. It's the same processes. We can think about this like the imperial boomerang coming home. There's all sorts of metaphors we could think about. Where they come together is Palestine and Mexico, that idea of the Palestine-Mexico border. What we see in the Caribbean with this expeditionary force is just one latest example of this, I think.
I'm curious how you see things going with the attempts to justify a potential military expedition in Mexico. Because I remember, even in 2023, 2 years ago, this was an extreme right-wing opinion, where only Lindsey Graham and Marjorie Taylor Greene were advocating for it.
The Mexican government is no longer in charge of most of their country. It's a narco-terrorist state, and we should put on the table the tools of our military to go after these terrorists as if they were any other terrorist. And they're killing more Americans from drug cartels in Mexico than all the terrorist activity combined since 9/11.
But now, I mean, the reports the DEA was considering doing drone strikes. This is an entirely mainstream opinion within the Republican Party. I mean, Claudia Sheinbaum is not a pariah in the same way that Maduro is. There is no revanchist attitudes towards the Mexican government, at least to my knowledge, that you're talking about with Cuba and with Nicaragua. I mean, how far do you see this potentially going?
And I'll also add, what do you make of the ongoing military efforts on the border, Operation Lone Star, what the state of Texas has been kind of quietly undertaking for the past several years on the constitutional argument that they are invoking the invasion clause without any kind of like real basis for doing so?
I mean, this is part of it, right? The hypocrisy doesn't exist anymore either, right? The hypocrisy disappeared just like international law. The Mexico case, I mean, I think the first time I started to read opinions coming out of the U.S. government, particularly from the U.S. military, that Mexico was some sort of failed state that may require U.S. intervention in the future was around 2010, 2011. And it was just like different like U.S. military officials kind of like, you know, spitballing, dangerously so, considering the history of U.S. Mexico. But it has been really weird to see the ramping up of this rhetoric and becoming more commonsensical and mainstream from 2011 to today of the idea that the U.S. should involve itself militarily in Mexico. Obviously, it wouldn't be the first time, right? Half of Mexico's national territory was taken by the U.S. During the Mexican Revolution. The U.S. invaded Mexico twice, occupied a port city, invaded northern Mexico. But I can't stress how horrific of the policy and the decision this would be for a variety of reasons. Like for self-serving American gringo reasons, Mexico is its largest trading partner. Like, why would you attack your largest trading partner? Why would you attack a massively popular political project in Mexico led by Morena that, for all of its rhetorical posturing and ideas and proclamations about protecting Mexican national sovereignty, they still go along with U.S. like drug interdiction efforts, right? They may have set limits on the DEA. They may have set limits on the FBI. I think AMLO, López Obrador, the president before Sheinbaum, famously expelled them. But then he just turned to the CIA and said, we will work with you guys because you guys can like shut the fuck up and do things covertly. And there's a Reuters story from a couple of weeks ago, excellent piece of reporting by Reuters Mexico-based reporters that uncovered like a really deep-seated CIA, active CIA operation in Mexico in which they're working with specially vetted Mexican Army and naval units, Marine units, to go after the Sinaloa cartel, to go after the leadership of the Sinaloa cartel. If Trump orders some sort of attack on Mexico, that shit ends. Mexican cooperation with drug interdiction and the interdiction of migrants ends. This bipartisan migrant brutalization program that we've seen since the late 90s that has been thoroughly bipartisan has constantly depended on fundamentally Mexican cooperation. Trump can brag about no one coming to the border because of Mexico, not because of Operation Lone Star, because of National Guard units deployed to the border. It's because Mexico has become the wall. You attack Mexico, that's going to end as well, which in my mind, that's probably a good thing, but whatever. I don't want to see my heritage homeland getting attacked. Even that CIA program, and this kind of connects to Venezuela, it kind of exemplifies the ridiculous aspect of this all in my mind. Those CIA vetted units within the army, the Mexican army and the Mexican Marines, they were going after drug kingpins. And this is like such a dumb strategy fundamental to the US-led war on drugs. The idea that if you take out a drug kingpin, that's somehow going to impact the flow of illicit narcotics into the United States. It's so stupid. It's like we have so much evidence that this doesn't, El Chapo is in Colorado in a Supermax prison, and yet the drugs continue to flow. It has nothing to do with that. But this is also the same logic with targeting Maduro, right? Let's say if they if they do try to take him out, right? It's still that same logic. We take out the drug kingpin, and then we get to accomplish, we can declare victory over drugs, or in his case, over a narco-terrorist president. That's not going to do anything. If anything, what that does is spark a lot of violence within these drug trafficking organizations, where there'll be a lot of infighting between who takes over. It also will inspire rival groups to try to take on the group that just suffered the assassination or detainment of their leader. This drug kingpin strategy, it does a lot of work politically and rhetorically for the U.S. government, but it doesn't change any reality on the ground, and the drugs keep flowing. So if Trump, I think the type of military intervention that could envision Trump ordering in Mexico would be some sort of targeted drone strikes on supposed narco leaders or narco labs. It's not going to do shit. It's actually going to be very counterproductive in ruining U.S. and Mexico relationships that are very important to the United States, while at the same time not accomplishing the goals of that very military strike. And so there's a certain circular self-defeating aspect to Trump's policy toward Mexico and toward all of Latin America to this day that I don't know what to make of. I don't know if they're playing fourth dimensional chess, and they want that circular war to continue because it continues to justify their existence, or if they're just really stupid and tragically stupid because it ends up hurting a lot of innocent people.
One thing that's very striking in hearing you lay out that failure of strategy is the exact same failure of the war on terror, right? The exact same failure of strategy of targeted drone assassinations. You even yourself named Obama's drone program and the continuation of the so-called war on terror under those means as being the rhetorical justification or grounding for the actions that we're now seeing Trump apply to Venezuela and Latin America more broadly. And so to me, it sounds like there is a kind of intertwining of the war on drugs and the war on terror. I think there's a broader historical point that can be made about how both of these things are American strategies of empire that, yes, are dumb and are failures, but are broader attempts to recoup from the military failure in Vietnam and trying to retain hold on America's hegemonic position and trading short-term political victories for long-term strategic failures. I think that these two broader strategies perhaps come together in a term that we've heard you say and has come up, which is narco-terrorist, which is like combining kind of the war on drugs and the war on terror. I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about what this term is, what it means, and how it's employed.
Yeah, so the term narco-terrorist or narco-terrorism was developed by a predecessor of mine here at Arizona State University. He had long since retired when I first got here. A guy by the name of Louis Tams, who was Reagan's ambassador to Colombia, also was Reagan's ambassador to Costa Rica in the early 80s. And then he ended up being one of the star witnesses during the Iran-Contra hearings in the late 80s. He started to develop this idea of narco-terrorism to think about future challenges to U.S. hegemony, U.S. empire over Latin America in the event that the Soviet Union is overthrown. So in many ways, he was anticipating what was going to happen in the 1990s. So he was able to, just by coining this term, he was able to fuse what he saw as the two main threats to U.S. control hegemony over the Americas, right? The narco part, which he was involved with, right? Because as U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica, he was involved with supporting the Contras who were attacking the Sandinistas from Costa Rica, which is kind of, again, some of this contradictory shit. And then the terrorism, right? The terrorism obviously in the 80s is referring to like the PLO. It's referring to Palestinian efforts to resist Zionism. And you do have a lot of think pieces coming out of right-wing quarters in the 80s who take Louis Tam's idea of narco-terrorism and they start applying it to this broader idea that the Kremlin was the one who was like that was the narco state, and they were pulling all their mini narco states with Sandinistas, the PLO, and other organizations to hit at U.S. empire. And it was actually in the 80s under Reagan where you start to see the foundations of the kind of U.S.-led war on drugs that we see today. So he identifies and he signs things into existence that say, look, our biggest threat to national security, U.S. national security in the mid-'80s is actually narco trafficking. And Elliot Abrams was the guy that he sent around the country to make that point. Good old Elliot Abrams. And then he also started to link the illicit trafficking of narcotics into the United States as a national security threat to rising undocumented migration. So you see, so it's not, so the narco, the terrorism, and also the migration angle to it. And I think this is what we see today with what Trump is doing in Venezuela. It's the war on terror logics with war on drugs logics and war on migrants coming together as a singular way of thinking about how to once again exercise and project U.S. imperial power over the Americas. And then you have the overthrow of the Soviet Union in the 90s, and the U.S. is, scrambling around the world trying to find a new as essential threat to justify its global hegemony and its empire and its hundreds of military bases around the world. And the 90s are really weird because they couldn't find that threat. Well, but one of the threats they really glob on is the idea of narco-terrorism. It's narco-terrorism and gangs that are linked to migrants. And one way to kind of track this to look at all those really, like, I would say good, but most people say bad action films from the 90s. Like, who are the villains in those films? And it's always some weird hodgepodge mix of like Colombian narco traffickers with some left-wing guerrilla from Latin. Like Escape from LA has the best one. It's like this guy who's a narco trafficker and a Shining Path guerrilla. His name is Cuervo Jones, which is like really interesting. But so in that space between the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the war on terror, it's that narco-terrorism threat that the U.S. empire is able to use to then think about how to project in a new way its power over the Americas. And it culminates with Plan Colombia in Colombia, right? This massive U.S. military aid package that is ostensibly counter-narcotic, but people who participated in this and people later like Biden and who claimed credit for having developed this, it was a counterinsurgent, right? They were dumping ton of money, U.S. money into Colombia to try to defeat the longest existing military guerrilla threats in all of Latin America, right? The FARC and the ELN, who were still operating and fighting and threatening to take over the Colombian state in the 1990s. I think the whole narco-terrorism thing has come back in a really forceful way today because I think it's for Trump, it's going to try to do what it did for the U.S. empire in the 1990s. It's just a different type of threat that they can mobilize against without, in their idea, I still find it hard to believe that they're going to do like a U.S. invasion, but it will allow things like blowing up Venezuelan fishing boats and maybe even targeted assassination attempts against leaders of Venezuela and other countries that are deemed to be non-compliant with U.S. empire.
I mean, you're talking about all these examples of media where they tried to push this. I'm still shocked at how mainstream these attempts to push this still are. I mean, there was a film called Act of Valor where there was an attempt to connect a Mexican cartel with Chechen Islamist rebels. And then there was Modern Warfare 2, which came out a couple of years ago, where the IRGC was seeking retaliation for a Soleimani stand-in by collaborating with another Latin American cartel so they could fire ballistic missiles at America.
Hassan was taken back into cartel protection in Las Almas. Mexican special forces confirmed Hassan is moving something sizable towards the U.S. The cargo could be containers housing missiles. We don't know how many, and we don't know the targets.
Like, there's so many attempts to make this not even just into a threat to America, but it has to be an existential threat to the United States, something that necessitates a gigantic American military response in multiple different countries in multiple different regions. I wanted to ask about these accusations that I see in the media sometimes about governments, sometimes with the assistance of the Mossad, breaking up Hezbollah cells in Latin America, different Hezbollah-linked groups in Latin America. Is there any veracity to these connections, these groups, or are these media inventions primarily?
I think a lot of these incidents lack a lot of veracity. I think they're doing more political work than actual police investigations based on actual existing activities that are deemed criminal by local governments and by the United States. I mean, since the war on terror, we've seen so many efforts within U.S. media and the U.S. government to link really disparate groups into some sort of international conspiracy, just like the one I mentioned for the 1980s. The Kremlin is at the top, and they're the ones moving their PLO and their Sandinista, narco groups to do their bidding and to poison the United States. I mean, a lot of this has to do with positing the United States is always on the defensive, is always the victim, right? We're always being poisoned by evil brown men who are pushing their drugs onto hapless white victims in the United States. And Latin America is the weakest flank of the United States, right? So it's a soft underbelly. So we also have to reaffirm a military projection and power over that region to prevent that whole region, and Mexico specifically, from becoming some sort of Maginot Line. But most of these are just ridiculous things, right? Like trying to link Evo Morales, Hezbollah, Hugo Chavez, MS-13, and like the Sinaloa cartel, like as a thing, like as like an actually existing evil international legion of doom that is trying to bring down U.S. empire. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it does a lot of things politically, particularly domestically within U.S. politics. The idea of trying to link, I remember reading a story that implied that Al-Qassam and Hamas learned how to make tunnels from El Chapo. And like it was El Chapo's like tunnel building. That actually is a real thing, right? Like I think El Chapo is now known or remembered to be one of the innovators in digging tunnels across the Mexican-U.S. border to bring drugs into the United States. Like that is a thing that happened. But then to try to link that to Gaza and to this expression of national liberation and armed resistance is kind of ridiculous. But that's happened for 20 plus years. And I would say the vast majority, if not all of them, is just straight up bullshit, right? The idea that, what was another good one? Louis Gohmert, who was a Texas representative, he made a big deal of this in the 2010s, that Al-Qaeda was setting up training bases in Mexico. And part of the training that occurred on these bases was that these Al-Qaeda militants would change their names to Spanish surnames. They would learn how to speak Spanish, and then they would sneak into the United States as undocumented migrants and then create terror cells within the United States.
We know Al-Qaeda has camps over with the drug cartels on the other side of the Mexican border. We know that people are now being trained to come in and act like Hispanic when they're radical Islamists. We know these things are happening, and it's just insane not to protect ourselves and make sure that people come in, and as most people do, they want the freedoms we have.
That's like, I can't stress like how ridiculous and absurd that idea is. But then it goes on to become like the plot of a Taylor Sheridan film, The Sicario 2, and like it becomes mainstreamed, right? And the way that movie begins is with a really, the suicide bombers walking into a Texas supermarket and blowing themselves up, and they crossed in from Mexico.
DOJ get an idea on those other suicide bombers?
Not yet.
I might want to get on that.
There's proof Reyes' cartel helped one of them get to the border, so we know enough to move forward.
I'm sorry, I had to suppress myself from laughing hysterically. I cannot believe that's the actual plot of the movie.
No, there was, so in the 2000s, when you had the rise, the reemergence of like right-wing white supremacist border vigilantes along the U.S.-Mexico border, they would make claims that in the Sonoran Desert, they would find like Qurans, or they would find like prayer rugs. So for them, that was evidence that like Al-Qaeda was sneaking into the United States from Mexico across a famously easy border to transverse, right? Like the most military, one of the most, if not the most militarized border in the world. And they were coming into the U.S. that way. When, as we all know, 9/11, those people famously did not enter the United States through the U.S.-Mexico border. They entered through other borders that are much until recently, much less heavily policed. So these conspiracy theories are, again, in my mind, are trying to link those three wars that the U.S. uses as an organizing framework for waging empire: the war on terror, war on drugs, and war on migrants.
I'd like to talk about how this reverberates back onto U.S. domestic politics, because a lot of the narratives that we're talking about in the media, we're talking about as a means of justification for U.S. endeavors overseas. But we're also seeing them, especially since October 7th, 2023, we're seeing them show up in terms of U.S. strategies of repression against domestic political dissent. So, quite famously, we've seen the weaponization of immigration consequences against vocal advocates for Palestinian liberation. The case of Mahmoud Khalil and others, focused on campuses. But it seems to me that those are playing into that same slippage and that same conflation and that same kind of blending of different narratives. So I'm curious, one, how you see that playing out on the domestic front, but two, also, if you see that as potentially an opportunity for new coalitions in the United States, new coalitions of resistance, right? Because we can laugh about these connections and say this is like so absurd, to tie these two things in these two regions together. But I think the inverse of that is to ask the question of what coalitional possibilities emerge from the conjoining of these different axes of repression.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, and it's a hopeful point that we all need, I think, right now. Yeah, and I think we see that in Latin America. I think we do see some of this coalitional work and building happening at the grassroots level, where it's pretty obvious that the streets and the grassroots are with Palestine, right? The problem has been how to translate that into pressuring their governments to do more than just give half-hearted statements on how there should be a two-state solution as a form of resolving the so-called war in Palestine. In the United States, I think that the fact that the U.S. complicity and support for the Israeli genocide of Palestinians is in West Asia is coming back and shaping domestic policy does offer that opportunity, particularly around the issue of migration, I think. Particularly since opponents of Palestinians and migrants tend to use the same logics and discourses that they use against Palestinians, right? And the right for Palestinians just simply to exist. And I think that's where I see the hope. And I like the way that you laid it out, Dylan. I think it is happening. It's happening at the city and local level, slowly, but it is happening. You've seen it. The photo that I was able to use for my NACLA piece on the Palestine-Mexico border from Abraham Marquez, the journalist who took it, right? That this community in Southern California that quite militantly resisted the attempted entry of ICE into their community. Like these people, and a lot of these like our homeboys, right? Like they're like, you would say the lumpen proletariat. Like they were still making these connections between what ICE was trying to do to the community in a place like Paramount or in a place like Compton with what they've learned through social media about what's happening in Palestine, right? So that graffiti of like, fuck ICE, free Gaza is really powerful. And to me, that is the way out of this. The thing is, it is happening at the local level, but at some point it has to translate beyond the local to the national. And what are the vehicles or what are the organizational vehicles and frameworks that will allow that translation to happen? And that's what we're not seeing right now. It speaks to like the weakness of the U.S. left, right? I mean, the fact that the U.S. left was organizationally exterminated during the Cold War. I mean, there's a consequence of that. But that's always been a problem of the U.S. left in general since, let's say, the 80s, right? With few exceptions. Like, how can we as a left adopt a more internationalist politics? And like migration has been the issue just sitting there for decades now. Like we should be using the issue of migration as a way to organize a more internationalist-based politics and form of organizing. Like just simply asking, why are people here? Why can a journalist like Juan Gonzalez write a book whose title is the thesis and the point of the history of U.S. migration to the U.S.? The title of that book is Harvest of Empire. Like U.S. migrants and asylum seekers are here because they are harvest of U.S. empire, all this shit the U.S. empire has done in Latin America and the Caribbean. Like that as an entry point for like leftist organizing would be so powerful. And we have seen instances of it. We just haven't seen it at the national level. And I think that's what's something that we have to think about. It is happening at the municipal level. It's happening at the city level. People are drawing these connections between Palestine, between asylum seekers, between the role of U.S. empire and all of this. But how can that be projected onto a regional and national scale where these things become central organizing politics, not just reducing migration to like Latinx or Hispanic politics, right? Which is what at the national level, decrepit organization like the Democratic Party will do. And they will just like kind of segregate that issue as part of their outreach, half-hearted, contradictory outreach to so-called Hispanic voters, while on the other side, they're adopting all the border security and border brutality that the Republicans are espousing. But I think about that graffiti a lot about fuck ICE, free Gaza. And I think there's a lot there, a lot of organizing and thinking to do around how to connect those two things beyond just the local level. LA has been really, since October 7th, Los Angeles has provided us with a lot of instance and examples of how to do this. I remember there was Abraham, this journalist, posted a video, was it 2024, of a protest, pro-Palestine protest in Los Angeles. And there was a lowrider just outfitted in like keffiyeh, and like Abu Ubaida's image was on the lowrider, and it was like free Palestine. That was like another image that sticks in my mind, right? And that me sharing that video, actually, I made it into Al Quds network. Whenever someone said this is what happens when Hamas comes to your house, I can't remember what the original post was. And I posted that Abraham's video, and I'm like, this is what happens when Hamas comes to my house. And it was a video of this amazing lowrider with Abu Ubaida's image just emblazoned on it, right? Like, so the possibility is there. People are thinking about this and connecting the dots. We just need the organizational capacity beyond the local level to translate this into a more powerful movement. In the last 2 years, I've also gotten a lot of requests from like Spanish language media to talk about this. That's another issue where we need people who can speak about these issues, well, I would say the right way, right? Our side, in Spanish to a huge community in the United States that only listens to Spanish language media, but they get bullshit, honestly, right? They're getting like Univision and this kind of like a type of media that has its roots in like Gusano media, right? Like, so that to put it bluntly, can people who have other forms of linguistic skills, particularly Spanish, can we engage that media sphere to talk about these issues where we can make the connections quite clear between Gaza, between the US-Mexico border, between what's happening in Venezuela?
And we need a hotkey Jeremiah Wright, goddamn America, that we can just press.
Yes. Please. That'd be great.
Okay, I think that we can probably wrap here. This is a really, really excellent discussion. So thank you, Alex, so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
No, not God bless America, God damn America, that's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.